The dog would not stop scratching at the door. Marcus heard it from the kitchen, a low, insistent sound, claws dragging against wood. And at first he thought Bear just wanted out into the yard. It was almost 4 in the afternoon. Danny had gone up for a nap 2 hours earlier, same as always, and the house had that particular quiet that Marcus had learned to trust over the last 8 months. But Bear did not want the yard. Bear was standing at the base of the stairs now, barking in a way Marcus had never heard him bark before, sharp and rhythmic, and then running halfway up the steps and back down, again over and over, looking at Marcus each time like he was trying to drag him along by the collar of his shirt. Marcus set down the dish towel. He was already moving before he consciously decided to move, taking the stairs 2 at a time with Bear scrambling ahead of him, and when he pushed open Danny's door, the boy was on the floor beside the bed, body rigid, lips going the color of a bruise. If you have ever loved an animal that turned out to understand you better than you understood yourself, you already know there's more to this story than a dog barking at a door. Stay with this one until the end, because where this started is not where you'd expect, and what that dog did in the months before this afternoon is the reason Danny is alive to have a favorite dog at all. 10 months earlier, Marcus Doyle had walked into the county shelter on a Tuesday morning with no intention of adopting anything. He was there to fix a door. That was his job. He ran a one-man handyman operation out of a truck with faded lettering on the side, and the shelter had called him about a supply closet door that wouldn't latch, the kind of small, unglamorous work that paid the bills between bigger jobs. He was 41 years old, a widower for the last year and a half, and he had a 9-year-old son at home who had stopped talking about his mother almost entirely, which worried Marcus more than if the boy had cried about her every day. The silence was the thing Marcus couldn't fix with a screwdriver. He'd tried counseling, twice, and Danny had sat in the chair with his arms crossed and answered every question with as few words as the rules of conversation would allow. He'd tried baseball, which Danny had liked before, and Danny had gone through 2 seasons standing in right field looking like he was waiting for something else to happen. Marcus was not a man who gave up on things, but he was starting to understand that some problems didn't have a hinge you could just realign and screw back into place. He was thinking about none of this when he walked past the kennels on his way to the supply closet, tool bag in hand, and a woman near the front desk called out that if he had a minute, there was a dog back there who'd been there longer than anyone liked to admit. Marcus didn't have a minute. He had a door to fix and a boy to pick up from a friend's house by 4. But something about the way she said it made him glance down the row anyway, and that was how he first saw the dog that would later save his son's life, though of course he had no way of knowing that yet. The dog was a mixed breed, some kind of shepherd blend, gone soft and gray around the muzzle, easily 8 or 9 years old, lying against the back wall of his kennel with his chin on his paws. He didn't bark. He didn't come to the front of the enclosure the way the younger dogs did, hurling themselves at the wire in a bid for attention. He just watched Marcus with dark, steady eyes, the way a man watches weather move in, patient and unsurprised. The card on the kennel said his name was Bear. It said he'd been surrendered when his elderly owner went into assisted living, and that he'd been at the shelter for 141 days. Marcus had fixed the door in 11 minutes. It was a simple job, a misaligned strike plate, the kind of thing he could do with his eyes closed. But he found himself walking back past the kennel on his way out, and the dog was in the exact same position, watching the same stretch of hallway, as if he'd been waiting to see whether Marcus would come back at all. Marcus did not adopt a dog that day. He told himself, driving home, that a grieving 9-year-old boy did not need one more responsibility, one more living thing, to worry about outliving. He told himself that gray muzzle meant a shorter runway, meant Danny might just be signing up for another loss down the road, and God knew the boy didn't need practice at losing things. He told himself a lot of reasonable things. He went back 3 days later. Anyway, this time he brought Danny, though he framed it carefully, the way you'd frame a decision you hadn't fully made yet. He said they were just looking. He said dogs were a big commitment, and they'd talk about it as a family, which was a strange thing to say when the family was down to 2 people. But Marcus was trying. Danny didn't want to go inside at first. He stood by the truck with his hands jammed in his jacket pockets and said the shelter would smell bad, which it did a little, and Marcus didn't argue with him. He just said they could look for 5 minutes and leave if Danny wanted. Danny came in on those terms, the terms of a boy who has learned that adults' promises about time limits are usually kept, at least by this particular adult. They walked past 3 kennels of dogs jumping and barking, tails a blur, tongues out, all of them auditioning. Danny didn't stop for any of them. He kept his eyes down. The particular flat expression he'd worn for a year and a half now, the one that made teachers write concern notes home and made strangers at the grocery store give Marcus that look of pity he'd gotten so tired of. Then they reached Bear's kennel. The old dog was in the same spot he'd been in 3 days before, and this time he lifted his head when they approached. He didn't jump. He didn't bark. He got up slowly, the way an older body gets up, and walked to the front of the kennel and sat down. And he looked at Danny, the way he'd looked at Marcus days before. Steady, unhurried. Like he already knew something about the boy that the boy hadn't said out loud to anyone. Danny stopped walking. He crouched down in front of the kennel, which he had not done for any of the other dogs, and Bear leaned his head against the wire mesh. Not pawing at it, not whining, just leaning. Patient. The way old dogs learn to be patient because barking and jumping stopped working for them a long time ago, and stillness became the only language left. "He's not doing anything," Danny said. "No," Marcus said. "He's not." The other ones were doing a lot of stuff. "Yeah." Danny looked at the dog for a long moment, and Marcus watched his son's face do something he hadn't seen it do in a year and a half, which was nothing at all. No flatness, no forced smile for an adult's benefit. Just quiet, unguarded looking, the kind of expression a person only wears when they've forgotten someone's watching them. "How old is he?" Danny asked. "Card says 9, maybe older. They're not always sure." "That's old for a dog." "It is." Danny was quiet for a while. Bear hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, just kept his head against the mesh like he had all the time in the world, which was, Marcus thought grimly, probably not true. But the dog didn't know that, or didn't care. "He's been here the longest," Danny said. It wasn't a question. He'd read the card himself. 144 days now. Nobody wants him, because he's old. Probably quast. Danny put 2 fingers through the wire, and Bear, without any drama at all, leaned into them, closing his eyes. Marcus signed the paperwork 40 minutes later. He would say afterward, on the rare occasions he talked about it, that he didn't remember making a decision so much as watching one already being made by 2 parties who hadn't consulted him, his son, and a 9-year-old shelter dog, who had apparently agreed on something in the 90 seconds Marcus had gone to find a staff member. The drive home was the longest conversation Marcus had had with his son in months, and it was almost entirely about the dog. Would he like the house? Would he be scared of the truck? Should they stop and get a bed for him? Or was that something they already had? Marcus answered every question, like it was the most important one anyone had ever asked him. Because in a way, it was. The first weeks were not a montage. Marcus wanted to be clear-eyed about that, even years later. Bear was an old dog adjusting to a new house, and old dogs carry old habits. And there were accidents on the kitchen floor, and a night in the second week where Bear wouldn't come out from under the dining table for 6 hours, and Marcus had to leave a bowl of food and just wait him out. Talk. There was an appointment with the vet that revealed a heart murmur. Mild for now, the vet said something to monitor rather than panic about, but a fact that sat in the back of Marcus's mind afterward, a low hum of worry he didn't share with Danny. But there were other things too, and they built slowly, the way trust builds in a house where nobody's in a hurry. Danny started coming downstairs earlier in the mornings because Bear slept at the foot of his bed, and when Bear got up to go find his water bowl, Danny got up too. Danny started doing the feeding, measuring out the kibble with the plastic scoop, checking the water bowl before bed without being asked. Small competencies that Marcus noted without commenting on, because he'd learned that praising Danny for things directly sometimes made the boy retreat from doing them again. As if attention itself was a kind of pressure he couldn't stand. Bear, for his part, did the quiet work of an old dog who had apparently decided this house was his last one, and he intended to do the job right. He followed Danny from room to room, not in an anxious way, just in the way of an animal keeping tabs on something he'd claimed as his. He lay outside the bathroom door while Danny brushed his teeth. He sat under the kitchen table during dinner, with his chin resting on Danny's foot. When Danny had nightmares, which still happened 2 or 3 times a month, Marcus would hear the soft click of claws on the hallway floor. Before he even got out of bed himself, Bear already moving toward Danny's room like he'd heard something Marcus hadn't. Marcus watched all of this, the way he watched everything carefully, without making a show of it. He was not a demonstrative man. His late wife, Carol, used to tease him gently about it. Said he loved, like a mechanic, checking the oil, rotating the tires, showing up on time, rather than with big declarations. She'd meant it fondly. Marcus thought about that a lot, in the months after she died, wondering if his quiet, steady kind of love was enough for a grieving 9-year-old on its own, or whether the boy needed something louder than his father knew how to be. Watching Bear, he started to think maybe loud wasn't the only way to say it. There was an afternoon in the 3rd month, a Saturday, when Marcus was up on a ladder cleaning the gutters, and he heard Danny's laugh come up through the open window, an actual laugh, unguarded, the sound cracking through the yard like something breaking open, and Marcus nearly fell off the ladder trying to see what had caused it. It was nothing dramatic. Bear had gotten his head stuck briefly in an empty cereal box Danny had left on the kitchen floor, and Danny was doubled over watching the old dog back around the kitchen, with a box on his head like it was the funniest thing he'd witnessed in his life. And maybe it was, by then, the funniest thing he'd let himself witness in a long time. Marcus stood on that ladder for a full minute just listening. He did not go inside to see it happen in person. He didn't want Danny to feel watched. He just stood there and let the sound wash over him. And when he came down off the ladder later, his eyes were wet, in a way he didn't examine too closely, because a man fixing gutters doesn't have time to unpack every feeling that comes up through a window. By the 4th month, Bear had a routine so ingrained that Marcus could set a clock by it, which turned out to matter more than he understood at the time. Every day at exactly 10 in the morning, whether Danny was at school or home for the weekend, Bear did a slow circuit of the house. Kitchen, living room, hallway, the base of the stairs. Then again at 2 in the afternoon. Then again around 6, before dinner. Marcus noticed the pattern because he was a man who noticed patterns. It was half of what made him good at his job. Walking into a house and immediately clocking which floorboard was going to be the one that creaked, which outlet had been wired by somebody in a hurry 20 years ago. He asked the vet about it at a checkup, almost as a passing comment, and the vet had said some older dogs developed routines like that. Sometimes it was just habit. Sometimes dogs picked up on subtle changes in a household's rhythm that the humans in it didn't consciously register. Nothing to worry about, she said. Might even be a good sign, a dog settling into ownership of a space. Marcus filed that away and didn't think much more about it. He should have. He would think about it a great deal later, replaying that vet visit in his memory, wondering if there had been a moment earlier in the timeline where the dog had been trying to tell him something, and nobody in the room had the vocabulary to hear it. Danny had epilepsy. It wasn't a secret, exactly, but it also wasn't something Marcus led with, not because he was ashamed of it, but because he'd learned that, once people knew, they started treating Danny differently, more carefully, in a way that made the boy feel like glass instead of like a kid. The diagnosis had come 2 years earlier, before Carol died. A single seizure at school that had sent the whole family into a spiral of tests and appointments and a medication schedule that had, for the most part, kept things stable. Danny hadn't had an episode in 14 months. The neurologist called it well-controlled. But Marcus called it something he checked on every single night before he went to sleep. A silent inventory of the day. Had Danny taken his pills? Had Danny slept enough? Had anything seemed off? He had not told the shelter staff about Danny's condition when he adopted Bear. There was no box on the form for it. It hadn't crossed his mind as relevant information, because at the time it wasn't information about the dog at all. It became information about the dog slowly, the way most important things in that house seemed to arrive. Without announcement. In the 5th month, Marcus started noticing that Bear would sometimes plant himself directly in front of Danny for no obvious reason, blocking his path, gently, not aggressively, more like a suggestion that Danny sit down. Danny thought it was funny at first, a bid for attention, and would scratch the dog's ears and step around him. Marcus noticed it happened most often in the hour or so before dinner, and thought maybe the dog was just hungry and trying to herd Danny toward the kitchen where the food was kept. He mentioned it to a friend, another single dad from the neighborhood, named Ray, who'd had dogs his whole life, half joking, saying Bear had taken to bodyguarding his kid like it was a paid position. Ray had laughed and said some dogs got protective of kids. It was a known thing, nothing mysterious about it. Neither of them knew yet what the dog might actually have been noticing. It was in the 6th month that things started to sharpen into a pattern Marcus could no longer explain away as coincidence, though even then he didn't have the full picture. There was an afternoon when Bear refused to leave Danny's side for almost 2 hours, pacing at his heels through the living room, whining low in his throat, a sound Marcus had never heard from him before, plaintive and insistent. Danny said he felt fine, a little tired maybe, and went up for an early nap, and Bear went with him and lay pressed against his side the entire time, not sleeping himself, ears up, alert, watching the door. Danny woke up an hour later, groggy, saying he'd had a weird dream, a kind of static feeling, before it, hard to describe. Marcus asked the questions he always asked, checked Danny's pupils, asked if he'd taken his afternoon dose, which he had. Nothing came of it. No seizure. Marcus logged it in the notebook he kept. The quiet paper trail of his son's health that he'd maintained since the diagnosis, a habit from years of fixing things, where you always wrote down what happened before you fixed it, because patterns only reveal themselves on paper. He didn't connect it to the dog's behavior that day. Not fully. Not yet. But 2 weeks later it happened again. This same odd sequence, Bear growing restless nearly an hour before Danny complained of feeling strange, the same low whine, the same refusal to leave his side, the same insistence on lying pressed against him, rather than at a comfortable distance the way he usually did. And, this time, Danny did have a seizure, mild, brief, the kind the neurologist had told them to expect occasionally even with medication, lasting less than a minute. Danny disoriented afterward, but otherwise fine. Marcus sat on the floor of his son's room afterward, with Bear's head in his lap, and for the first time he let himself really consider what he was looking at. He went back through his notebook that night. He was a methodical man, and methodical men do not trust their memories when there is a page in front of them that can tell the truth more precisely. He found 4 separate incidents over 6 weeks where he'd noted unusual restlessness in the dog, and in 3 of those 4 incidents, some kind of neurological event had followed within roughly 90 minutes. The 4th had produced nothing, as far as Marcus could tell, though he wrote in the margin that Danny had described feeling foggy that evening, tired in a way that wasn't quite ordinary tiredness, which might have been a small event that simply never crossed the threshold into something visible. He called the neurologist's office the next morning, not in a panic, but with the particular calm insistence of a man who wanted a professional opinion on something he suspected was real but couldn't fully verify alone. The neurologist, a woman named Dr. Ferris, who had treated Danny since his diagnosis, did not dismiss him, which Marcus appreciated more than he said out loud. She told him that seizure-alert behavior in dogs was a documented phenomenon, not fully understood scientifically, but well enough observed that some organizations trained dogs specifically for it, picking up on scent changes or subtle shifts in a person's behavior or movement that preceded a seizure by minutes. She said it wasn't universal, wasn't something you could force a dog to learn, but that some dogs seemed to develop the sensitivity naturally, especially dogs who spent enormous amounts of close attentive time with the person in question. "He's been sleeping in Danny's room for 6 months, Marcus said. Practically every night. That would do it, she said, if he's capable of it at all. Not every dog is. Marcus asked her, somewhat sheepishly, whether they should get the dog professionally evaluated, formally trained, whether there was a certification, whether he needed to be doing anything differently. "You could," she said, "but honestly, Mr. Doyle, it sounds like he's already doing the job. Sometimes the best thing you can do is just trust what you're already seeing and stay ready to act on it." That sentence stayed with Marcus, stay ready to act on it. It was the kind of instruction that fit the kind of man he already was, a man who read the same page twice before trusting what it said, a man who kept a notebook, a man who checked the oil and rotated the tires and showed up on time, and now, it seemed, a man whose dog had quietly enlisted him in a job neither of them had applied for. He did not tell Danny the full extent of what he now suspected about Bear. He thought about it, turned it over for a few days, and decided against it, at least for the time being. He worried that if Danny knew the dog was in some sense monitoring him for medical crisis, it would turn the animal from a companion into a symbol of his own fragility, the very thing Marcus had been trying to protect him from since the diagnosis. He wanted Danny to have a dog who loved him. He didn't want Danny to feel like he had a dog assigned to him because he was breakable, so he kept the notebook, he kept watching, and he started, without making a production of it, paying much closer attention whenever Bear got restless, treating the dog's behavior the way he'd treat a warning light on a dashboard, something you didn't ignore even if you weren't totally sure yet what it meant. Ray, the neighbor, was the one person Marcus told the whole story to, mostly because Ray had been the one to first plant the idea in his head, even in a joking way, and Marcus felt he deserved to know he'd been more right than he realized. "You believe it?" Ray said. "Not really a question. I've got a notebook full of it," Marcus said. "I don't need to believe it. I can read it." Ray had laughed at that, the particular laugh of a friend who recognized exactly how Marcus's mind worked and found it reassuring rather than strange. "That's you. All over, Marcus. Somebody else would just believe their gut. You gotta have the paperwork." "Gut's wrong sometimes," Marcus said. "Paper doesn't lie, long as you wrote down the truth to begin with." It was a philosophy that had served him well across 2 decades of fixing things other people had broken or built wrong in the first place, and it turned out to serve him just as well here, in a much more important arena than door hinges and gutter alignment. By the 8th month, the pattern had become something Marcus trusted completely, though he never let his guard down because of it. Bear's restlessness preceded 4 more incidents over that stretch, each one milder than the last, Dr. Ferris adjusting Danny's medications slightly each time, the two of them working together, doctor and father, in the quiet, unglamorous grind of managing a chronic condition in a growing child. Danny's seizures were, by every clinical measure, well controlled and getting more so. But well-controlled did not mean gone, and Marcus never let himself believe otherwise, because a man who assumes a system is fixed forever is a man who stops checking it. Danny, for his part, had changed in ways that went beyond the epilepsy entirely. He talked more. Winnie. He'd started drawing again, something he'd loved before his mother died and had abandoned completely for over a year, filling notebook after notebook with pictures of Bear in increasingly elaborate scenarios. Bear as a superhero, Bear on a spaceship, Bear standing guard at the gates of something Danny labeled, in careful 9-year-old handwriting, Fort Bear. He'd made a friend at school, a boy named Theo, who came over on weekends specifically, as far as Marcus could tell, to see the dog as much as to see Danny, and the 2 boys would spend hours in the backyard constructing an ever more baroque obstacle course that Bear indulged with the patient weariness of an old professional who'd seen this particular game 100 times before and knew exactly how much energy it was worth expending on it. Marcus watched his son come back to himself. Slowly, the way water rises in a container. You're not staring directly at, imperceptible if you watch it every second, obvious if you look away and look back. He thought more than once about the 144 days Bear had spent in that shelter kennel, about the card that said nobody wanted him because he was old, about how close he had come to walking past that hallway entirely and never looking twice. He didn't think about it in a way that made him feel proud of himself, particularly. He thought about it the way he thought about a job that had turned out better than the initial estimate suggested, with a kind of quiet gratitude that the numbers had worked out the way they had, mixed with an awareness of how easily they might not have. Which brought him, in a roundabout way that he could only fully appreciate in hindsight, back to that Tuesday afternoon, in the 10th month, the one where Bear would not stop scratching at the door. Marcus had been in the kitchen making an early start on dinner. Danny had gone up for what had become, over the months, a fairly reliable Saturday afternoon nap, a habit the boy had picked up sometime around month 7 that Marcus privately suspected was less about tiredness and more about wanting an excuse to lie in a room with Bear for an hour with no particular agenda. It was 4 in the afternoon. The house was quiet, in the specific way Marcus had come to trust. The low hum of the refrigerator, a car passing outside. Nothing that suggested anything was wrong. Then the scratching started. Marcus had heard Bear ask to go out plenty of times before, and this wasn't that. This was faster, more urgent, and it was followed almost immediately by barking, sharp and repeated. A sound the old dog almost never made, not even at the mail carrier, not even at the vacuum cleaner, the two things that had reliably provoked noise from him in the past. Marcus set down the dish towel he'd been holding and walked toward the sound, and that was when he saw Bear at the base of the stairs, not at the back door at all, running up 2 steps and then back down, up and back down, looking at Marcus each time with an intensity that cut through any lingering hesitation. He did not stop to reason it out. He took the stairs at a run, Bear ahead of him the entire way, and when he shouldered open Danny's door, the scene in front of him arrived all at once, in the particular slow-motion clarity that Marcus would later describe. On the one occasion he tried to describe it at all, as looking like a photograph rather than a moment he was actually living through. Danny was on the floor beside his bed, having apparently fallen or slid off it, his body rigid, arms drawn in tight, his lips taking on a bluish cast that told Marcus, even through the roar of adrenaline, exactly how long this had already been going on, and exactly how urgent the next several minutes were going to be. Marcus had been trained for this. Dr. Ferris had walked him through seizure protocol more times than he could count, back when the diagnosis was new and terrifying, and the training took over now the way it was supposed to. Muscle memory doing the work that panic would otherwise have prevented. He got Danny onto his side. He cleared the space around him, pushing a small bedside table out of the way so the boy's flailing limbs wouldn't catch the corner of it. He did not put anything in his son's mouth, because he knew. The way every properly informed parent of an epileptic child knows, and every poorly informed bystander does not, that this was an old and dangerous myth. He checked the time on his phone, because Dr. Ferris had told him 100 times that duration was the single most important piece of information he could give her afterward. The seizure lasted just under 3 minutes. It was the longest one Danny had ever had. When it ended, Danny's body went slack, his breathing settling into the deep, exhausted rhythm that always followed, and Marcus stayed on the floor with him, one hand on his son's chest, feeling it rise and fall, the other already dialing Dr. Ferris's after-hours line, his voice steadier than he felt because that, too, was something he'd trained himself to do over 2 years of managing this particular fear. Bear lay pressed against Danny's back the entire time, not moving, not making a sound, now that the emergency had been located and the humans had taken over the parts of the job that dogs cannot do. Dr. Ferris on the phone walked Marcus through the assessment questions and, based on his answers, told him this was serious enough to warrant an emergency room visit, not because Danny was in danger in that specific moment, but because a seizure of that duration, longer than any he'd had before, needed proper evaluation and possibly a medication adjustment sooner rather than later. She said she'd call ahead to the hospital so they'd be expected. The drive to the hospital was the second longest conversation Marcus never had with anyone, this one entirely silent, Danny drowsy and disoriented in the back seat, Bear's leash looped around Marcus's wrist because there had been no time to consider leaving the dog behind, and Marcus wasn't sure in that moment that he wanted to. At the hospital, they told Marcus what he'd already half known driving over. The seizure had likely been building for longer than usual, a slow escalation that could sometimes happen even with well-managed epilepsy. Bodies changing as children grew, medication needing periodic recalibration to keep pace with it. If it had gone on much longer without intervention, without Danny positioned safely, without prompt medical follow-up, there was a real risk of complications. The kind of complications that emergency medicine exists specifically to prevent when caught in time and struggles to reverse when it isn't. The doctor on call, a calm younger man named Dr. Alvarez, asked Marcus a fairly ordinary intake question. How had he known to check on his son so quickly? And Marcus had answered honestly, because he did not know how to answer any other way. The dog told me. Dr. Alvarez had looked at him for a moment, the look of a man deciding whether he'd misheard, and then Marcus explained briefly the pattern he'd tracked in his notebook over the past 4 months. The restlessness that preceded episodes, the timing, Bear seemed to sense, before anyone human in the house had a clue, anything was wrong. "That's not uncommon, actually," Dr. Alvarez said, echoing almost exactly what Dr. Ferris had told Marcus months earlier. "We see it reported more than people realize. Doesn't always get taken seriously until something like this happens." "It got taken seriously in my house," Marcus said, and there wasn't any pride in the way he said it, just fact, the same tone he'd have used to describe a properly wired outlet. Danny stayed overnight for observation. Dr. Ferris adjusted his medication the following week, a change that, over the subsequent months, brought his seizure frequency back down to the low baseline it had held before. The emergency room visit turned out to be, in the long run, exactly the kind of catch-it-early intervention that prevented a much worse outcome down the line, the kind of prevention that only works because somebody noticed the warning early enough to act on it. Bear was not allowed in the hospital room itself. Hospital policy being hospital policy, even for a dog who had, by any reasonable measure, just done more to save a boy's life than most of the equipment in the building. He waited in the truck with a nurse's aide who took pity on Marcus and offered to sit with the dog in the parking garage rather than leave him alone, an act of unremarked-upon kindness that Marcus never forgot, and thanked the woman for every time he happened to see her in the following months. Because he was a man who remembered small kindnesses the same way he remembered small warning signs carefully. And for a long time, Danny came home 2 days later. He was quieter than usual on the drive back, processing something Marcus suspected went beyond the seizure itself. And it wasn't until they were back in the house, Danny sitting on the living room floor with Bear's head heavy in his lap, that the boy finally said what he'd apparently been turning over since the hospital. "Bear knew?" Danny said. "Before it happened, didn't he?" Marcus sat down across from him. He had decided, somewhere in the sleepless hours of that hospital stay, that the time for keeping this from his son had passed, that a boy who had just lived through the thing itself deserved the truth about the dog who'd tried to warn everyone it was coming. "I think he did," Marcus said. "I've been writing it down for a while now, the way he acts before things happen. I wasn't sure at first. I'm pretty sure now." Danny was quiet, running his hand slowly along Bear's graying muzzle, and Bear leaned into the touch the way he always did, patient, unhurried, the same way he'd leaned against the kennel wire the first day they'd met him. "Is that why we got him?" Danny asked. "Because you knew he could do that?" "No," Marcus said. "We got him because nobody else wanted him, and you looked at him like somebody should." He paused. "I didn't know any of this back then." "Neither did you. I don't think even he knew. Not really. Not until he'd been with you long enough to learn you." Danny thought about that for a while. "That's kind of the same thing, though," he said eventually. "Like, he learned me because he was paying attention. Nobody else paid attention long enough to notice anything about him at the shelter. But we did, and then he did the same back." Marcus looked at his son for a long moment, struck by an observation that was more precise than anything the string of counselors and pediatric specialists had managed to articulate over the past 2 years. A 9-year-old boy explaining, in his own plain language, something true about attention and reciprocity that Marcus wasn't sure he could have put into words himself. Not that clearly, not on his best day. "Yeah," Marcus said. "I think that's exactly it." He reached over and scratched behind Bear's ears, and the old dog's tail thumped once against the floor, slow and satisfied, the tail of a dog who had done his job and knew it without needing anyone to tell him so, because that had never been the currency he worked in to begin with. In the months that followed, life in the Doyle house settled into a new and steadier rhythm. Danny's medication held. His seizures, on the rare occasions they still happened, were mild and brief, and Bear, true to form, gave Marcus enough warning that they were never caught off guard again. Marcus kept the notebook going because a man who trusts a pattern doesn't stop watching for it. Not ever, not even after it's proven itself 100 times over. Danny went back to school with a note in his file that named Bear, specifically, at Dr. Ferris's suggestion, as part of his medical support system, a fact that made Danny inexplicably proud, in the particular way 9-year-olds are proud of things that make them different in a good way rather than a bad one. Ray started calling Bear the mayor as a running joke on account of how seriously the dog seemed to take his responsibilities around the neighborhood, checking in on Theo when he visited, supervising the obstacle course construction with an air of grave professional oversight, greeting Marcus at the end of every workday with the same unhurried, steady look he'd first given him through the kennel wire 10 months and one saved life ago. Marcus never did anything as dramatic as tell the shelter what had happened, not out of secrecy, but because it wasn't really in his nature to make a story out of something he still mostly experienced as ordinary life, morning feedings and evening walks, and a boy laughing in the kitchen over a dog with a cereal box on its head. But he did go back once, almost a year after that first visit. Not for a door this time, just to drop off supplies, a box of blankets and food. They bought too much of the kind of quiet, unrequested generosity that comes naturally to people who understand exactly what a place like that had once given them. The woman at the front desk recognized him, asked how the old dog was doing. The gray one, the one who'd been there so long nobody thought he'd get picked. Marcus told her simply that he was doing fine, that he'd turned out to be exactly what they needed, in ways nobody in that building could have predicted the day he signed the paperwork. She smiled and said that happened sometimes. The ones nobody wanted, turning out to be the ones you couldn't imagine living without. Marcus said that was about the size of it, and thanked her, and drove home to the house where his son was waiting on the porch steps with an old gray dog sitting patient and steady beside him, watching the driveway the way he always did, the way he'd apparently been built to do all along, waiting for the people he decided were his to come back through the door.